Hi and welcome to RC Modders, and this the second in the build series on the Bruder Telehandler. The main point of this video is to in some detail show the building of the wheels. Finding a way of getting Bruder wheels to match on to either N20 motors or indeed in the case of the larger models the 1-inch gearbox motors has actually been one of the major breakthroughs in terms of being able to adapt the Bruder toys to full radio control and keep the look the same by keeping the same wheels and tires, etc. Throughout this build series I intend to do everything in great detail because I want those who are completely new to modelling to be able to follow this as easily as those who are quite experienced and are probably more likely to skip through my videos slightly more. Just before I carry on with the build video, there was one quick update that I wanted to do. Those of you who saw the video which I did a couple of days ago running the teleloader with a bunch of other models may have noticed that the bucket was not only moving very slowly, but actually it didn't appear to have an amazing amount of torque either. So I've done some reconfiguring in the transmitter and I think I've managed to fix that. So I'll just show you quickly. What I've done is I've kept the movement of the arm on this wheel here, so that's actually quite nice because it latches into position whenever I let go of it. What I did have was I actually had the bucket movement on the other wheel over here, so I've managed to retain the mixing and I'll show you that in a moment. But what I've done is I've actually moved the bucket or fork angle onto this stick here, which usually will be the throttle stick on a transmitter, and what we have is we have very controllable but much faster movement and actually much more torque, and I've tested it with the digging and that's absolutely fine. Because I've retained that mix, it's actually going to continue to make it easy to keep either the bucket at the same angle or, more importantly, the forks when it's in forklift mode fairly level and easily enough to adjust on the fly as it's moving up and down. I just thought I will give you that update because, to be quite honest, I really wasn't quite happy with that. I was okay with it in forklift mode, but I was not happy with it in bucket mode. Right, on with this video. The first thing I want to do is just take you through some of the tools which I'm going to be using for this first part of the build. These are the tools that I'm using. They're not necessarily recommended, and I guess that there are lots of ways around this, but if anybody's wanting to follow the build exactly as I've done it, these are the tools which I'm using. In terms of the larger tool, some kind of vise, and I tend to use a bench vise. However, a pillar drill vise like this would suffice for anything in this stage. Drill, although I am actually likely to use the pillar drill for drilling the nuts, which you'll see in a bit, but a normal drill would do the job. Some sort of Dremel-like device with a cutter on the end of it. This will be for cutting the copper tubes. It can be done in other ways, for instance rolling with a knife, but I actually prefer to use this method. And in terms of smaller tools, you'll definitely need a file, something to mark holes in metal, and whilst you could use a centre punch, I'm actually going to be using this countersinking bit with its point in the end, 2.5mm drill bit, and it is actually worth having a new bit for this particular job, otherwise it can make life much more difficult. I tend to check the size of my drill bits all the time while I'm using them. Whilst I feel that I'm familiar, I have made the odd mistake, and you certainly don't want to be making a 3mm hole when you're after a 2.5mm hole and wanting to tap a thread into it. Ruler, always useful. M3 tapping bit, and it is worth buying a good quality one. The M3 is something which I use all of the time, and I would rather pay £10 for one of these than to pay £20 and get a set of 40 of them where actually the metal is more like cheese and you're going to break the actual one that you need most of the time. I believe that this is M3 by 0.5mm pitch. That's what they usually are, and it goes with the standard machine bolts and grub screws, etc. Something to put this in. So normally you would use a piece like this. It goes in there like that and it gives you some leverage. I also like to use a pin vise when I'm trying to get into an awkward spot or go in particularly straight. For this particular job, a blade like this on the end of a scalpel handle is actually a very, very useful shape. You can use a more normal shape, and I would probably be using both of them anyway, but that one is very useful for this job, and you'll see why in a minute when we get to doing some cutting. Stanley type knife comes in handy all of the time throughout the build, so I'll include that. 13mm long reach spanner plug, 1.5mm hex key. You do want to always make sure that the end of one of these is sharp, or that you're using a new one, otherwise you can easily damage the grub screw and get it stuck in there. Drilling those out isn't much fun. And some super glue. And that's really it for the tools for this stage, and a lot of these tools will be used throughout the build anyway, and I certainly use these on all of the builds. In terms of parts, the list is a lot shorter. So we have the 4 wheels, which we separated in the previous build, 4 M8 metric nuts. It's actually worth having an M8 bolt on hand in order to clean the threads out, but I'll come to that in the build. 4mm copper tubing. I'll make sure that I update the links in the description below, where incidentally I'm putting all of the parts so that people can see what I'm talking about. And we're going to need 4 M3 grub screws. I think that 5mm is probably about the right length for this. I'll update the description and parts list to include where I was able to get quite a few different sizes of these from Amazon, which I think will be very useful for time to come. And I think that that's kind of it in terms of the tools that I think that I'll be using and the parts which are needed to complete the build stage. Right, so the first thing we need to do is we need to remove the wheel from the hub here, and we actually want to retain the wheel arch because that is going to pop back on the model, and I think it looks really good when it's going along and these are steering. So it's really just a matter of carefully filing off the top here. I'll just do that and I'll come back to you. And after a couple of minutes you actually see that you can start to see the pin appearing there, so we're almost through. That's it, it seems to have worn away, and with a bit of luck, quick tug, if that wasn't even really a tug, it almost fell off, we'll have the 2 parts separated. Just need to do that for the other 3 wheels. Right, so that's that done. Now for those of you who've got a grinding wheel, if you actually heat up the pin using that, you can actually pull the whole thing out without grinding the pin all the way down, and that actually pulls out the axle too, which means that you could miss out the stage that we're going to do when we actually pull the axles out cold. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to remove all of these flat pieces here going around the edge. And in order to do that, we're going to use the scalpel blade. You have to be really careful with these because it's easy enough to slip and either slice the tar, or worse than that, slice into your finger. In order to speed the process up a little bit, I am going to go around carefully with the side cutters just to remove some of the material. This isn't something necessary, but it's just going to make it a bit quicker for me. With these tires, you can actually push them down, and this is something which I'll probably do several times in the build for different reasons, and that allows you to get to everything. Perhaps I should have mentioned side cutters and the tools for the stage. It seems to be removing these parts quite nicely. So that's most of it removed with the side cutters. Then it's a case of going through carefully with the knife and getting it absolutely flush with the side here if you want the bolt to sit flush. Without digging in. And then going in from the side, and this is the bit where you have to probably be the most careful. Just getting it nice and flat. Like so. You can see how this shaped blade is probably better than the sort of more traditional larger ones. Okay, so that's that done. Do the same for the other 3 wheels. Okay, so that's these 4 done. It's quite important to get this as flat and as clean as possible so that when the nuts go on, they're going to sit nice and flush and not be wonky, which will help give you much truer movement on the wheels when they're turning. The next thing to think about are the nuts and making 2.5mm holes in those and then tapping them. So you're going to want to make the 2.5mm hole as straight as possible through the centre there, and if possible get it in the middle of one of these plates. Obviously you can use a centre punch to mark where you want the drill to go to stop it wandering. I'm just going to do the same thing using this piece here because I think it's going to be a little bit easier for me. There we go, there's a little dot there and that'll be enough for the drill to locate on and to not move around. I'll just do the other 3. Before I go down the shed and drill those holes, I think it's worth putting the nuts on the wheels which have got the axles so that we can do the cold pull when we get down there. So you just rest that on the top there, so that it's gripping a tiny bit. Get this on the top and then that's it. That seems to have gone on reasonably tight, and you just keep going until you can just see the plastic poking through there. Okay, so we can go down the shed, and what we're going to do is we're going to do a cold pull on this using a vice and a claw hammer, and then we're going to be drilling the holes. Incidentally, this method where the axle was heated up and poured out, whilst it's much quicker and easier, I think you've got a much higher risk of causing the hole in there to be not quite straight and then potentially having wheels that wobble. We'll see when we do this, but this method here with the cold pull is definitely much safer even if it takes a little bit longer. Okay, so the first thing to do is to get the axle firmly mounted in the vise. That's not going anywhere. Get a claw hammer, lever it on there nice and straight, and then just push gently. And then maybe move it in a little bit because there's no rush here. there we have it. Very simple and absolutely no risk whatsoever of causing any misalignment by heating it up. There we are, 2 wheels ready for the next stage. Drill out the nuts. Get it in about the right place. Seems to be okay. Okay, the next thing to do is to tap each of the nuts using the M3 tap. So it's quite important to kind of start off straight with this. And when you feel resistance, you go back slightly. Even though I'm only going to use 1 grub screw, I'm going all the way through because that way I can get to the thickest part of the thread on the tap. Seems to be okay. And then using an M3 machine bolt, I just want to test to make sure that thread's all working alright. That seems to be, so that is also good. And before I put this back on a wheel, I'm going to clean up any messiness of the thread inside there using an M8 bolt. So let's just do that. And this can sometimes be a little bit stiff to get in there because it's actually cleaning that thread up. Otherwise you're likely to have problems as it cuts its thread into the plastic and the shape on the inside of the nut thread isn't quite right. Okay, it's fine. And so if I take one of the wheels, this should actually just be able to thread on by hand using the thread that we'd already established when we were taking out the axle. That's fine. Using the 13mm socket again, do it up, and that should just go on quite easily, and keep going until you get all the way to the bottom. You don't have to go ridiculously tight, otherwise you're going to strip the thread, but that seems to be sitting there nicely. At this point I just want to test the 4mm copper tube. That seems to be going in. It's fairly tight fit, but that's really exactly what you want. And then I want to trim down this piece of plastic here down flush with the bolt. The easiest way I found to do that is to actually go around with side cutters first, just to get rid of the bulk of the plastic, to make it a bit quicker. Going most of the way down, but not all the way down to the nut, because I don't want to weaken anything inside the nut, but I don't want to have to carve off loads with the knife in a second either. So that's probably about enough. And then taking the scalpel again, I'm just literally and carefully going to carve all the way around. Like so, to make it flush, so that's okay. Now I'm going to want to trim this copper pipe to about that point there, and I'm just going to mark it off. With a felt tip, because that will give me a cutting guide, like so. And just for information, it's somewhere around 11 millimeters. So I'm just going to trim that off using the Dremel. Right, so we have a piece here that should easily fit in. Want to be careful not to lose it. Just making sure it does fit. The copper tubes then need to be super glued into place inside the wheels. Let's just push that in. Like so. Do the other 3 wheels. Okay, just to make sure that the glue's set properly, quick squirter activator. Right, that's that. The reason that I glue these in is that I found in the past that if you don't, first of all they can start wearing an uneven shape in the hole in the plastic, and also they can actually twist around and then you find you can't get the grub screws through. So it's definitely worth gluing them. We're almost there. Next thing to do is to push down one side near where you've got a hole in the nut. Take your 2.5 millimeter drill bit, and actually I'll take my own advice, have a quick check, make sure that that is indeed a 2.5 millimeter drill bit. It will be a disaster at this stage if I was using the wrong size here. You might have a little bit of plastic stuck in the hole here. It's probably worth just picking it out, make it easier to drill. A little bit better. And then just draw straight through both sides, but try not to go through the rubber tar on the other side. And then taking the M3 tap, we should just be able to follow that through the hole that we made in the first place. We only really need to go in from one side. And that seems to be alright, so let's take that out. Test it with the bolt. That's okay. Make sure the hole's nice and clean. That's okay. And then taking one of those 5mm M3 grub screws that I talked about in the parts requirements. Let's put that on when I can remember which side we're going in from. That's that. And then I might as well test our newly built wheel on the original prototype. So the flat of the motor is there, so I'll just put this on there like so. That fits on nicely. Screw it up. Yep, that goes perfectly. Pull this out. And let's see if the wheel moves true. Well, the tyre's going to take a few moments to recover from me bending it around, but I think that we have success there. Just do exactly the same thing to the other 3 wheels, and that will be this stage completed. The wheels are probably one of the most fiddly bits of the build and potentially quite time consuming. Off camera I could build them obviously in a fraction of the time, but I thought that I would do this in some detail because, believe it or not, it's very easy to mess this stage up. It's very easy to split or crack the wheels, and so I thought I would do it in some detail. Coming up in the next part of the build series, we're going to be preparing the lower chassis, fitting the motors and the steering knuckles, and basically getting it to a state where we've got a rolling chassis, in fact a powered chassis, and basically completing the lower part of the model before then moving on to the upper stages. I hope that you found this useful and easy to follow. As ever, and in particular with these build videos, feel very free to leave comments and ask questions, etc. And until the next time, as ever, thank you very much for watching.